Am I in the way?
Oh, no, you're fine.
Okay.
I think we're going to get started because most of you are here, and it's a real pleasure to have you all come here today. We're very pleased to have you. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our education director, Joe, who's going to introduce our great speaker, Mr. Marler. So Joe, come on up.
Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing tonight?
We're good.
Awesome. Now, I know you're all as excited as I am to listen to David tonight, but first I'm just going to give you a little background so you know who exactly you're hearing from, for those of you who may not know. So David Marler joined MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, in 1990 as a field investigative trainee. He has served as a field investigator, state section director, and the Illinois state director during his time with MUFON. So he's also conducted numerous investigative missions into alleged UFO sightings. He also has appeared on several news programs and spoken in front of audiences around the country about UFOs, sightings, and things like that. And he recently had his book published, Triangle UFOs, an estimate of the situation published. In his book, he provides comprehensive analysis of triangle UFOs through meticulous research. So he's just like a lot of you, he wants to dig deeper into this subject. He wants to know whether or not this is fact or fiction. Now, he's an independent UFO researcher, and he works for an international medical company and resides in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So definitely has a very interesting background, and like all of us, he works on the side, but this is a very important thing in his life and something he's passionate about. So without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce David Marler. Please give him a round.
Thank you for all being here on this wonderful wet Saturday afternoon/evening. I want to thank Joe. I want to thank the entire staff of the National Atomic Testing Museum for allowing me to be here. This is a great honor. Being affiliated with the Smithsonian Institute, I really was very appreciative of this invitation. I was just mentioning actually in the lobby just a moment ago, I had the pleasure of also working on a Smithsonian Institute-sponsored documentary series, UFO'S Declassified. I'm not sure if anybody had a chance to catch that series. It aired first in Canada, then the UK, and then here in the United States. Yeah. I'll share a few clips with you. Unfortunately, when they aired it here in the United States, they changed it and modified it slightly. They wanted to get the skeptical approach, so they had the arch skeptics that were also in the documentary, which was not in the Canadian and the UK version. So I'm going to show you the Canadian UK version and just share some information. Also because it illustrates some of the cases and characteristics that we're going to talk about this evening. Now, has anybody heard or seen my research prior to this evening, either on documentaries, books? Okay, good. So this won't be redundant for you. Hope to educate you, hopefully keep you entertained, keep you alert throughout the presentation. The one thing I like to do, though, obviously the UFO subject is very amorphous, right? Where do you establish boundaries for a subject like this? One of the things, UFOs, we all have different takes. We may have skeptics in the room, believers, or someone like myself, which I consider somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. And certainly we all fall somewhere along that line. But I always like to start off with a foundation that I think we can all agree on. UFOs, whether you relegate it to fact, fiction, or folklore, I think you'll agree it's part of our history. There's no removing it. I mean, you look at military history, for example. I did a recent lecture in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I told the audience there that you look at New Mexico military history over the last 50, 60 years, commensurate or related to that, you're going to find UFO cases, high-profile military UFO sightings and UFO cases. So I'd like to start off just by mentioning that. But despite the diverse history that we have with UFO subjects, starting, of course, with the modern era of ufology in 1947, we had initially reports of flying discs, balls of light in the sky. Later, we had stories of alien entities sighted in conjunction with these landed craft. We had abduction accounts. But then in 1989, there apparently was a shift in the phenomenon. Suddenly, we started getting reports of these large triangular UFOs. And it certainly captured my interest. My first introduction was the Yuma Journal. As Joe mentioned in the introduction, I was a member of MUFON starting in 1990. And in February '92, when I received this, for some reason this cover image resonated with me. And like many of you, and like many people that heard about my book, they made the comment, triangular UFOs. I thought they were all disc-shaped objects. And in point of fact, we started getting reports in Belgium around the city of Brussels of these large triangular craft. And you may have seen this chronicled in many UFO documentaries over the last several years. But I found that very intriguing. The sightings were primarily along the German border down here around Luxembourg, but there were not just triangular objects. There were balls of light seen, objects of other shapes and sizes, but predominantly they were triangular. And the sighting started on November 29th, 1989, and went until about the spring of 1991. What was particularly interesting is that the Belgian military was actively involved in investigating and tracking these UFO reports. In fact, on the July 11th, 1991, General de Brouwer, then Colonel de Brouwer, actually held a press conference and stated that they had F-16 radar data of this object or objects being tracked. But prior to that, it was confirmed by 4 separate NATO ground-based radar tracking stations. So this is not just eyewitness reports we're dealing with radar confirmation, and not only this, but other cases that we're going to look at as we look at the history of these triangular UFO reports. So moving on, my interest was primarily academic as far as the Belgian wave. I was living in St. Louis, Missouri at the time, and I was Illinois State Director, as Joe mentioned in the introduction. And then on January 5th, 2000, we had a very dramatic wave of sightings of a triangular UFO. And it started up in this area. Here's St. Louis. We're about 35 miles east of St. Louis. We had a UFO based on all of the eyewitness reports, and we had anywhere from about 6 to 8 eyewitnesses that were the primary witnesses to this event. We had an object that traversed heading southwest over the village of Highland, moved south over Summerfield, moved over to Lebanon, over to Shiloh, down south, and then up around the village of Millstadt, and it was also observed by Ufo, a police officer here. Now, in close proximity to this, we had Scott Air Force Base, and as many people have alluded to or made the assumption, well, if this is out near a military base, it's probably a military aircraft, and I would agree with that. That's the most practical, plausible explanation. I was having a conversation earlier before we started, and we certainly, as UFO researchers, at least the majority of us, we don't leap to the extraterrestrial hypothesis as a possible explanation for these sightings. We really try to find credible eyewitness testimony. We try to properly vet these cases, and in many instances, we can dismiss UFO sightings as a star or a planet, and certainly I've had my share of the planet Venus being reported as a UFO. People saying, oh, it's a light in the sky, it's low on the horizon, it's dancing around. And when you look at the star charts, you look where they're seeing this object, it's in fact the planet Venus. And due to autokinesis, your eyes move slightly, it gives you the illusion that the light's moving. So we try to rule out all these practical explanations. But in this particular case, we had multiple police officers, at least four officially. There's one that never did officially go on record that I do know of, that was over here near Mascoutah, Illinois, near Scott Air Force Base, that also saw the UFO. But they were in radio contact with one another throughout this entire episode. And you may have seen some of the documentaries that chronicled this over the last several years. But as I mentioned, I did work on a Smithsonian Institute-sponsored documentary series called UFO'S Declassified. I just want to share a quick little segment of the documentary where they do illustrate the flight path of this object and my investigation into that. And I'll share a couple other segments later with you as well. So let's just go ahead and let you see what transpired on January 5th, 2000.
By plotting the 4 police sightings on a map, the object's flight path can be established. It travels 38 miles over a 1-hour period. Rare evidence of the movement of a UFO. The so-called Highland UFO makes headlines across the country, and like the Belgians and British before him, Marler begins with the obvious.
I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with Scott Air Force Base, and I have the official documentation as a result.
In a letter dated January 19th, 2000, 2 weeks after the event, the commander of Scott Air Force Base responds to Marler's questions.
They came back and stated negative, that they had no military aircraft in the area. They weren't testing or supporting the test of any vehicle in the area at that time.
But when Marler requests the radar data, he gets a response he isn't expecting.
They stated that at the time of the UFO sighting, their radar systems were down. They were not operating.
It's a surprising twist, especially when the radar data could be hard evidence of a UFO. But this doesn't stop Marler's investigation. He still wants to know what the 4 police officers witnessed in the sky.
Initially, I thought it was military in origin. It seemed to be the most practical explanation. But when we look at the eyewitness testimony, when we look at the description of this large triangular UFO, it bears striking similarities to Belgium, to Cosford. And at this point, we have to look at this information and come away with the fact that these witnesses are essentially describing the same type of object, if not the same object.
And that was what was interesting. I was already familiar with the Belgian wave 10 years prior to this incident. And as I was sitting in the police station interviewing these officers, they're sketching and describing not only how the object looked, but the performance capabilities, the flight dynamics associated with these objects. And I was amazed at the striking similarities that I was aware of related to the Belgian wave. So I thought that that was rather interesting, and that kind of fueled my interest in the subject of triangular UFOs beyond what I was already interested in with the Belgian wave. In point of fact, I talk about this in my book, we did have additional eyewitness testimony come forward, and compared to the original reports and the original conclusions, what we now believe is that there were in fact 2 triangular UFOs moving fairly close in conjunction with one another. One over the area of Lebanon. We had another police officer later that actually came forward reporting his testimony of seeing this object, which was corroborated by other eyewitness testimony, virtually at the same time. And one of the patterns that we're going to find as we delve into the history of these specific UFOs, these triangular UFOs, is quite often these objects are seen in pairs or groups of more than just one. And we also have a report of a rectangular UFO that was sighted very close in proximity that seemed to be flashing lights back and forth as almost signaling each other. And that's purely, just speculation. But that was what the eyewitness described. It was almost like they were signaling each other back and forth. So we may have actually had 3 anomalous objects in close proximity to a major Air Force base. And again, I think the military explanation could be a plausible one, depending on what we're dealing with as far as aircraft. But as I think and hope that as you go through the history with me, you're going to see these reports go back very, very far, not just decades, but perhaps hundreds of years. And at that point, it really begins to stretch the imagination to dismiss all of these as military aircraft. So again, looking at the parallels between these 2 famous cases, we have the shape of the objects, again, primarily triangular. The lights on the objects had very similar patterns, very similar characteristics. Absence of noise except for one instance. And so that's one of the characteristics that really resonates with these individuals that report these objects. They see a large object overhead not making any sound. I've had witnesses describe other triangular UFO reports, and they stated to me, matter of fact, we felt like this thing was going to crash on us because we're used to hearing some type of aircraft or engine noise associated with a large object overhead. And the fact that it was completely silent, we felt it was going to just drop right out of the sky. Flight characteristics, the ability for these objects to hover, rapidly accelerate, and then decelerate, and then making these sharp, flat, angular turns. And by that, rather than banking like a conventional aircraft, they'll maintain a horizontal position and simply pivot and then move off into a different direction. So if these are military aircraft, they're clearly demonstrating some different type of propulsion technology than conventional jet propulsion. Then we have the witnesses. In the Belgian incident, as well of November 29th, '89, as well as January 5th, we had police officers in neighboring municipalities in radio contact, literally stating, the object appears to be heading in your direction, and moments later, the other officer saying, yeah, I see it, but I don't know what the heck it is. So we have them constantly in contact, and again, looking at Belgium and that Illinois case, my attitude was, at this point, I was starting to develop a very large library. I now have one of the largest UFO libraries on historical newspapers, reports, military reports, etc., photos, film. John's nodding his head here. John's been to my home and he's seen it. John Alexander's here who wrote the foreword to my book. But I started delving into the amount of historical material that I had, and what I found was that Belgium and Illinois had reports of these triangular objects prior to these 2 famous incidents. Just want to share a couple with you. This was from Flying Saucer Review, Case Histories, August 1973. And here we have Brussels. And if you notice this area right here along the German-Luxembourg border, we have groups of sightings involving, in this particular case, 3 lights in a triangular pattern, but in some of the reports they described a triangular object. Now, what's interesting is this was in 1972. So we had a historical precedent for this. In July 72, ironically enough, SOBEP's investigators, this was the same Belgian group that investigated the later sightings in the early 90s, they were investigating these triangular UFO reports, and again, characteristics strikingly similar to the incidents that occurred from 89 to 91. In Illinois, there was this report from Flying Saucer Review, 1980, low-flying triangle in Illinois. I always like to point out they're just indicating where the UFO was with this little box. I have a lot of audience members in the back row straining their eyes thinking that's an actual photograph of the object, but they're just simply illustrating where, relative to the town and the water tower, where this UFO was sighted. This was a solitary witness case. We didn't have any corroborative testimony on the part of any other witnesses, but the object nearly landed according to the eyewitness, and it was outlined in multiple white lights, which could clearly discern or show a triangular shape to the object. But then, as any rational individual, my thought was, well, if there are previous cases that I found already tied to Belgium and southern Illinois, could there be others? How far does this pattern go back? And I think that's one thing that we look for as investigators is pattern recognition. If this is a genuine phenomenon, are there patterns in the data? And so I decided to look further. Before I did that, though, I wanted to, in 2004, in the early stages of my research, looking at historical cases, look to see what are the sighting patterns today. And by today, I mean 2004 at that time. Looking at the National UFO Reporting Center statistics, which is one of the largest clearinghouse of raw reports. Now, I'm very clear to state that these reports haven't been properly vetted. These are literally raw reports. Many of these have not been investigated and followed up by UFO investigators, but at least it gives us a finger on the pulse of what are people reporting. And in 2004, if you look here, they break it down according to sighting reports. The amorphous category of light, they had 5,509 reports, and these are cumulative going back several years. The next runner-up, though, was triangle, 2,782. So for people that think the classic flying disc was the #1 reported object, it actually came in third. So just to give you an idea that these things are being widely reported by individuals. Now, could they be misinterpretations in many cases? Quite possible. Could they be hoaxes or lies? Quite possible. But then later, in a lecture I was preparing for that John attended in Eureka Springs, Arkansas in 2012, I wanted to revisit those statistics. Let's see if the pattern still continues. And in fact, again, looking at cumulative totals, light, 13,997 reports. The next runner-up, again, triangle, 6,957, followed by the classic flying disc at 5,288. So again, the pattern seems to be continuing. More people are reporting triangles than flying saucers. So in a sign of the times, you look at the UFO books now, you don't see the ever-present UFO or flying saucer, you see these triangular objects now on the cover of UFO books. So, whether you believe in the subject or you're a skeptic, you can sit here and say, well, there is a change regarding this phenomenon, or the mythology has changed regarding the subject matter. But the prevailing argument is that without the understanding that there are cases going back decades, if not hundreds of years, triangular reports must be relatively new, and therefore they must be military in origin. Certainly 1989, 1990, that was around the time the B-2 stealth bomber as well as the F-117A stealth fighter were being declassified. And the running joke, and we may have some people from Nellis or Area 51 here today, the running joke is, if we're hearing about this aircraft, they're already 5 stages beyond that. So what do they have that we don't know about? And that's what we have to concede. I have to concede that as a UFO researcher. I don't know what the state-of-the-art technology is that our military has. And so we have to be very cautious about labeling some or all of these things as extraterrestrial or genuine UFOs. They might be military in origin. We just simply don't know. But I think by the time you follow me through this historical research that I've done, I think you'll find that that's the wrong statement to make. And there is a history of reports. These are just some from my book that I included, and John's actually seen my extensive files, both at my home as well as his. I have hundreds of triangular UFO reports going back decades. This is one from the 1960s. This was in Connecticut. New saucer twist, flying triangle seen in state. 1960s. Lighting characteristics, the shape of the object, very similar. And in point of fact, when you read the entire article, the flight dynamics are virtually identical to the January 5th, 2000 case, as well as the Belgian wave. But we're talking 1960s in this particular instance. Another one. Now it's a flying triangle, strange object seen in La Crescenta skies. This was a daylight sighting in California by a woman that was also corroborated by a police officer. Another sighting in 1978, seeing is believing, Malibu man describes triangular shaped UFO. Are you starting to get the picture that these were around before Belgium? Another one, this is from 1960s as well. Mystery flying triangle spotted flashing over north, and this was over in England, sighting in the 1960s. And that triangle was no plane, and this was a wave of sightings of triangular UFOs seen over Cardiff, and I believe this was in 1983 that this occurred. Now, one of the prevailing questions is, okay, Dave, if these triangular UFOs have been around for a while, how long have they been around? One of the earliest accounts I have is going back to veteran and now deceased UFO researcher Donald Kehoe. He founded the NICAP organization, National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, and in his first book published in 1950, The Flying Saucers Are Real, he referenced a sighting in the Dutch East Indies back in 1890, where reports said most accounts described them as roughly triangular, about 100 feet on the base and 200 feet on the sides. Now what's intriguing about that is not just the reference to the triangular objects, but in the Southern Illinois case as well as Belgium, these were the estimates roughly as far as the size of these objects. So we're talking very large objects, assuming that these are even close to accurate assumptions. But then he goes on to say that in England and Scotland in 1895, there was a wave of sightings of triangular objects. And they state triangular-shaped objects like those seen in the Dutch East Indies. So I found that to be very interesting, going back that far. And we're going to talk about an even earlier case towards the end of this presentation. But this is really the question. If these triangular objects truly exist, where do they come from? In 2003, a Southern Illinois reporter did a newspaper article on the January 5th case, as well as my research into the triangular UFO mystery. And I love the title of the article. Is it us or is it them? And most people that have heard of these reports, that's pretty much the question that's on our mind. Is this something military, or is this possibly of non-terrestrial origin, someone else's technology, for lack of a better term? So my attitude is the origin of the triangles, there's three sides of the triangle, there's probably three answers that would be entertained. The first, which is again the most practical, is the United States military assets that's being tested or flown over civilian populations here in the United States and elsewhere. Extraterrestrial, let's at least throw that out as a possibility. You don't have to subscribe to that. But one that I kind of entertain is that we might be dealing with a combination of both. People are seeing triangular military aircraft, but some of these objects that are being reported demonstrate extremely radical flight dynamics. I've actually interviewed British Aerospace, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas aerospace engineers, and based on their knowledge, and some were involved in highly compartmentalized classified projects, they stated that some of these triangular UFOs demonstrate characteristics that we're working on, but to have a fully operational model in the field, they said we're years from something like that. That was their testimony to me. So looking at this, some of the explanations have been the V-2 stealth bomber. How many people have seen the stealth fly over, right? That's been an explanation that's been put forth. Now again, many of these objects have been seen to hover for long periods of time and make flat pivot turns. As far as we know, the B-2 does not do that. And there's one other element which I'll share with you momentarily regarding the B-2 explanation. This was one that was very popular in the late 80s, early 90s, the Aurora Project. Initially, Aurora was thought to be one high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that was actually being developed here at Area 51 as it was being, the rumor mill was being circulating regarding it. Then later we found that more than likely Aurora was an umbrella term that encapsulated a number of different aircraft projects that were being tested at the time. We still really don't have any clarity as far as the Aurora Project, but this is one other possible explanation. Another one is the TR-3A, aka Black Manta. This was discussed in Popular Science and Popular Mechanics at the time in the late 80s, early 90s, thinking that maybe this was the next evolution of the B-2 stealth bomber. So this was one other one. The most prevalent has been this one, the TR-3B, which is very prevalent on the internet. If you look up triangular UFOs, as many of you may have, they'll often reference, and I love the comments that people will make. They're like, oh, you saw a triangular UFO, that's the TR-3B. Like we know that this craft exists, we have credible information to document its existence. We don't. Just like the TR-3A, it's conjecture, it's stories. We have no credible information to show that this craft exists. It might honestly exist, but we don't have any credible information. Looking at the size comparison though, the B-2, it's 172 feet wide. Again, we're looking at anywhere from 300 feet long and 100 feet to 200 feet wide with these objects. So it just eclipses a B-2 stealth bomber. The other thing I like to mention is the fact that the B-2 stealth bomber makes noise. And again, these objects are silent, or at the very least, witnesses often describe a slight hum associated with the object. Now, Internet videos. Obviously, if you go on the internet, you type in triangular UFO, you're going to see a lot of these little guys. And I just want to just play this example for you. You'll see this and many other videos similar to this. This was actually in Florida in 2008. And as an investigator, I really don't waste my time on YouTube videos. The thing I like to illustrate with this one, and this is very demonstrative of other videos on the internet, you see points of light against a dark background. Of course, you have the camera movement. Could this be a 300-foot triangular UFO hovering at 10,000 feet, 5,000 feet? Possibly. Could this be a model suspended over your bed in your bedroom with the door closed and the lights out? Quite possibly. I'm not a video expert. I defer all internet videos to any video expert that's out there that can analyze these. They're intriguing, but in my estimation, it's just entertainment, unless you really have the credentials to dissect these videos in detail, which I don't. But I just share this one because I'm sure you've seen many videos similar to this. But as far as I'm concerned, the weight of evidence and in absence of hard evidence, which obviously we don't have, internet photos and videos are not good evidence in and of themselves. Physical evidence is absent. I wish I could throw a piece of triangular UFO here on the table that we could all analyze, but we don't have that. Radar visual cases are compelling, but very few. But I will talk about some of the cases that did involve multiple eyewitnesses with radar confirmation. And an individual case based on eyewitness testimony is insufficient. I mean, that's great, we have a credible witness, but ideally it would be nice if we had a witness out here in the parking lot that observed an object, and we have 50 other witnesses in a 2 to 3 mile radius that could corroborate that testimony. But in my estimation, multiple eyewitness testimony from varied sources worldwide that display a consistent pattern over the years is our best evidence to support the existence of these UFOs. And looking at that, there have been mass sightings as opposed to the solitary witness. And I just want to show you some of the history. Until I started delving into this, this was relatively unknown. In 1957, triangular spaceships were seen over Denmark, and that was their term. I have quotations there for a very specific reason. And I just want to read this segment to you. This was originally reported in Flying Saucer Review in 1958. And here you can see someone from the Danish Defense Intelligence Service showing where these UFOs were being seen. And in particular, and I quote this in my book, it states that the newspaper BT, in its April 16, 1958 edition, stated, quote, "Triangular spaceships have now appeared in the southern part of Jutland. From every part come reports of mysterious phenomenon in the sky towards the late evening. All witnesses state with certainty that conventional aircraft are not involved," unquote. It further goes on to state, quote, "So many reports of a similar nature have been sent to the Air Force Station at Skrydstrup that they have been unable to cope with them all, and more are expected in the near future." And I thought that was very interesting. Now, that was an initial article that referenced the newspaper article, and as I was mentioning to someone in the lobby before we began, I always try to find other information that bolsters. I don't just try to take one source of information. And I found another interesting segment here, and this was a Reuters News Service article, and it goes on to state, this was from 1958, it states that Danish officials have appealed for witnesses to corroborate a woman's statement that she saw a spaceship on April 15 near the village of Brohyr in South Jutland. The woman described the spaceship as big, black, low-flying object bearing on it white and yellow circle, which seemed to move. She stated that it flew over Brohyr, and while it did, a number of horseshoe-shaped objects emitting a strong light issued from it. And it also goes on to state, this is the Reuters News article, about 20 other witnesses reported seeing a triangular spaceship in the vicinity at the same time. So again, we do have reports going back to at least the 1950s in this particular instance. And the fact that the Danish military was investigating it is very similar to what the Belgians were doing in 89 and 91. Another military case involving the Danish again, as well as some of the NATO partners, was a sighting over the Danish destroyer UFO'S during Operation Mainbrace. This was the largest naval exercise since the end of World War II, and it was engaged in by multiple countries. And in this particular instance, the news report, the military teletype, which we have right here, it states that the first officer of UFO'S reported that they saw a flying luminous triangle last Sunday night. And it says that the officer was on charge on the bridge, and the captain had just turned in. The sky was clear when suddenly he heard a whistling sound and saw a flying triangle pass at high speed. And this was actually sent to the military headquarters in Copenhagen for further analysis. The one thing I like to point out about military cases before I forget, and John's here, so I always reference him, but it's nice to actually have him in the audience. to borrow his quote, if you're in the military and you report a UFO, to quote John, it's not a career advancing move. I mean, it's a surefire way to either ground you if you're a pilot, at least back during this era, and it's also a way to get passed over for promotion, to have that in your record. So a lot of these military witnesses put a lot on the line to report these UFOs. Now, meanwhile, back in Illinois, and this is what's interesting, the Danish wave was thought to be an isolated incident in 1959, or rather 1957, and it started in November of 1957. Back in Illinois, going through Air Force Project Blue Book files, I found this. On November 5th, 1957, there were 3 sightings reported in various areas. The one in particular here, large triangular red object, green light in front, yellow or gray in rear, low droning sound, traveling west to east and vice versa along the Illinois-Wisconsin border. Now, the same night, different time, we had one amber or orange triangular shaped object, 200 feet in size. Object was seen with red light and was in sight for 5 minutes. So here we have another account of not just a triangular object, but that 200-foot size estimate, very similar to the Dutch East Indies from the 1800s, and very similar to the Belgian wave. The thing that's interesting is you have a triangular object making a low droning sound, and the official Air Force explanation was it was an aurora. And they don't mean the aircraft, they mean the Aurora Borealis. And so I don't know how you can misinterpret the Aurora Borealis as a triangular low-flying object making a droning sound. So, as I like to state, the Air Force files from Blue Book are interesting because they do document the sightings. I just usually ignore their conclusions, and certainly we can all disagree on conclusions. So, moving on, in Indonesia, of all places, in November 1957, November 6th to be specific, we have another report from Air Force Project Blue Book files. Again, we're not talking the 80s or the 90s here. In this particular case, we have a report from an Air Intelligence Information report that the witnesses went on to say that the shape of the strange object that was observed over their fishing boat was triangular, and from each angle, white smoke was coming out. The top and bottom parts of the object were prostrated discs. So, a 1957 account of yet another triangular UFO, and of all places, Indonesia. So, and it was important enough to where it did find its way into the Air Force Project Blue Book files, which I think is intriguing. Now, in 1975, jumping ahead, talking about mass sightings of these objects, for about a 1-week period in Lumberton, North Carolina, there was a wave of triangular UFO sightings. Again, low altitude, large triangular shapes being reported. And like the January 5th case, the majority of the witnesses in this were police officers, lawmen. Sighting of V-shaped UFO reported by regional lawmen. And these are some of the original sketches done by the police officers at the time. Now, I have this new slide I wanted to share with you. Mr. Lee Spiegel, who's been a long-standing UFO investigator and investigative journalist, he works for the Huffington Post now. I met Lee in 2012 at an Arizona conference with John Alexander, and he just recently shared this with me. This was artwork done by artist Dale Hendrickson, and Lee was dispatched to go down to Lumberton after the first few days of sightings. As Lee relates it in his New York accent, he said, I got a call from J. Allen Hynek, and he asked me to go down to Lumberton to investigate these law offices sightings. And he said, I went down there thinking, well, I always wanted to see a flying saucer. Dr. Hynek said, no, you don't understand. They're not flying saucers. They're seeing flying triangles. And he goes, I was disappointed. I always wanted to see a flying saucer, and now he's telling me they're seeing triangles. So he goes down, and it's an intriguing story. It's one of those rare instances where he goes down as an investigator and actually becomes a participant. He went out on location, and this is an illustration based on that. This was recently done. And he's out on location with these police officers, 4 or 5 of them, and they're describing how they saw over this clearing a light a few nights back. And the object came out, or the light came out, and they realized it was attached to this large triangular object. As they're describing this to him, they see the light on the horizon appear. And they stood there for about 10 to 15 minutes, and the light approached, and this is based on Lee and the police officer's sketches. And again, I have them back here. You can kind of see, this is what they saw silently move overhead. And this is no artistic exaggeration. It actually put a spotlight down on Lee. He goes, I'm the guy standing in the middle with pointing my finger. He said he was standing there, the police officers were there. It shined a beam of light down for a few seconds and immediately turned it off and continued cruising in a linear flight path, not making a sound. So it's one of those rare cases where an investigator actually became a witness to the events. And so, again, law enforcement officers reporting these things. in 1980, November, there was a wave over Kansas and Missouri, and this was reported at the time by veteran UFO researcher Bob Pratt. Bob was a longstanding journalist. He also wrote for the National Enquirer, but he had done a lot of UFO investigations and reports in the early days, in the 70s and the 80s. And he wrote this: 100 spot gigantic UFOs cruises over 2 states. And these were some of the areas in question. And at least one triangular object was sighted. Estimated hundreds of witnesses over this entire area of north central Missouri and west central Missouri. And as I like to say, I don't always just go with one source of information. I mean, people are probably sitting there, Dave, you're quoting Reuters one minute, now you're quoting the National Enquirer as legitimate information. I did go to the news sources. It was actually reported in the Joplin, Missouri Globe, as well as the Herald Whig from Quincy, Illinois. And it goes into detail describing essentially what Bob had relayed in the National Enquirer article. Now, what's interesting, though, is this is one of those instances where in Kirksville, Missouri, they were tracking an unknown target on radar that correlated with the sightings that night. So, again, we appear not to just be dealing with visual sightings. We have radar confirmation to back that up. And after my book was published, I actually had a witness contact me who stated that he saw the object on that night. So I was able to speak with him and get additional testimony. One of the more famous waves that garnered quite a bit of media recognition was the Hudson Valley, New York wave from 1983 to roughly 1986. This involved large triangular UFOs, but also boomerang or chevron-shaped objects. And me mentioning Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he co-authored the book with Philip Imbrogno and Bob Pratt, who we just mentioned, and they wrote the book Night Siege that documents this wave of sightings. Hundreds of reports were being seen by law enforcement officers and civilians. I did a series with the Science Channel where they recreated this particular UFO wave in detail. But again, sightings from 83 to roughly 86. Then again, it brings us back to the Belgian wave from roughly 1989 to 1991. This gentleman right here, Mr. Patrick Farron, was the head of SOBEPS, which is now called COBEPS, and that was the UFO investigative group working in conjunction with the Belgian military at the time. And I'd like to add this, that after my book was published, I was actually contacted by Patrick, and it struck up a longstanding collaborative research agreement. And this was us in Santa Fe last summer. He actually came into the United States, met with me, and we were able to compare notes and sit down. And it was really interesting to have that international level of cooperation where they were asking me as many questions as I was asking them. Because, you know, I think we all need to put our heads together to try to figure out what's going on. But this is Patrick and I going into detail, reviewing cases and details. And it was really nice. We do video Skyping, but it was nice to actually see him in the flesh for a change. So, and then there's the Phoenix Lights case. Many of you are probably familiar with this from 1997. There was this large V-shaped or chevron-shaped object that traversed the greater part of Arizona, including Phoenix and the surrounding suburbs. Most people describe 5 lights in a V formation. Now, despite these famous waves stretching back over the decades, we also have previous research that's been cited. This goes way back to 1959 in Flying Saucer Review. This was the first article devoted to triangular UFOs that I could find in the literature, and it was written by W.A. Westcott, and he discusses some triangles as being as large as 300 feet in length back in the 1950s. So again, we see this commonality in this large size being reported. At that time, they called them the unidentified deltas or flying deltas. There was a follow-up article done in '65 where, by the same author, where they described the triangles or delta volants, flying triangles, as moving edge forward at times with the apex trailing. So, you know, you think of a triangular object, you think the point would be the lead portion of the aircraft. They found in the 1960s and 1950s that that wasn't the case, that you'd actually see a triangle flying backwards, if I can use that term. And the interesting thing about that is with modern day reports, we're finding in some cases the same thing. And this defies all conventional aerodynamics as we know it. I mean, that just, imagine a B-2 bomber flying backwards. That just really stretches the imagination. I do like to mention Omar Fowler in the UK. He was investigating triangular UFOs before I started my research, and he was very nice in sharing some of his case material, primarily from England and Scotland, where he had some reports. These are just some of my research files that I've gone through, and I found some surprises along the way. There was a famous wave of sightings in Dexter, Michigan back in 1966, and this actually caught the attention of the state representative Gerald Ford at the time. And they were seeing UFOs, but the Air Force was dismissing it as swamp gas or marsh gas. And UFO sighters were counting back saying gas theory hot air, say UFO sighters. And this actually garnered a lot of international and national media attention at the time. Now, I found this interesting. Going through the newspaper archives, I had always heard that these were football-shaped objects or saucer-shaped objects. This particular newspaper, the Charleston Daily Mail, described the sightings as this. Sightings were reported 3 times within a week in the Ann Arbor, Michigan area and nearby town of Dexter. Many made by police officers who described the objects as triangular in shape. So we may have had saucer-shaped objects, but apparently there were also triangular objects being seen in 1966 in these areas of Michigan. So much for swamp gas. You know, how do you take swamp gas and turn that into a triangular object? Wanacue, New Jersey, they also had sightings in '66, and again, most were described as saucer-shaped or elliptical objects that were being reported. And then I found these additional items that were reported at the time, which I thought was very interesting. And it goes on to state here, on the same night, other witnesses on Long Island reported seeing a low-flying triangular object which emitted a shrieking sound. And then over here, it says, police officers, civil defense officials, and many others reported seeing brilliant flying objects and triangular objects over the Wanacue, New Jersey reservoir on several occasions. So this is 1966, triangular UFOs being reported. And then I found this, a surprise witness. Anybody recognize who this man is?
Barney Hill?
No, actually Kenneth Arnold,
Oh,
from
okay.
1947.
Wow.
He was the man who launched the term flying saucer. He was actually misquoted. He described seeing 9 saucer-shaped or crescent-shaped objects over Mount Rainier as a private pilot. And he was misquoted, and he said, well, the objects moved like a saucer skipping across the water. And he was misquoted by a United Press reporter. And he said, well, according to Arnold, he saw flying saucers, and that's not exactly what he described. But what many people don't know, and I didn't realize until I was doing my triangular UFO research, in 1966, he saw a triangular object in the sky. And the article actually states, hundreds of residents of the city, as well as myself, this is Arnold's being quoted, observed what seemed to be an enormous triangular aircraft of some sort. Even though it appeared to be at a tremendous height, its shape and form was easily discernible. It then goes on to state that this object, it was explained away as an atmospheric balloon. However, no one at the airport or the control tower, to the best of my knowledge, had ever seen a triangular balloon. Arnold said, too, that the object was moving in a direction counter to the wind, which was blowing that day. So, I found that to be very interesting. I'd never heard of Arnold being tied to a triangular UFO sighting. Then, what launched my interest in 1973 at the age of 5 years old was a sighting around the area of Piedmont, Missouri, which is in southeast Missouri. And this wave of sightings was actually investigated by Dr. Harley Rutledge, who was a physics professor at Southeast Missouri State University. And I have archival radio interviews with him from that time period. And he was the head of the physics department at SEMO, Southeast Missouri University. And his colleagues, he related in the radio interviews, kept saying, well, you're a physics professor, why don't you go down there and explain away all this? And his exact words in the early stages was, UFOs, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. He was more concerned with his credibility and standing within the university. But the reports continued to pour in. The media was certainly covering it, and not only newspapers, but on television news segments. And he finally decided that as a physics professor, I know science, I should be able to go down there and find a rational explanation for this. He went down as a skeptic, and not to use the term believer, but I don't know what else to use. He came away realizing that there was a genuine phenomenon beyond rational, conventional explanation. And it was interesting. I actually attended this conference, and this is his son, Mark Rutledge. Dr. Rutledge passed away several years ago with Alzheimer's. But I met his son, Mark Rutledge, at a reunion benefit that we had regarding this particular wave of sightings. And as I'm sitting there in the front row, like you are, Mark's up here lecturing, and keep in mind, I've read lots of UFO books over the years. He said, yeah, he goes, my dad saw a lot of stuff out there. They reported a lot of strange stuff. They saw balls of light, disc-shaped objects. Then there was that one particular night my father saw that triangular UFO go overhead. And I completely had forgotten about that, having read this book years before I was delving into the triangular UFO mystery. I had the book with me, and I leaped to it right away. And sure enough, Chapter 8, A Terribly Strange Night, this is what Dr. Rutledge wrote about. And again, he was a skeptic going down there. He had no perceived bias towards UFOs. If anything, he was trying to go down there to debunk the UFO subject. He stated that the object may have been a flying wing, but one of extraordinary size and one that flew without sound. During public lectures I've given about UFOs, a few scientists have suggested that the craft might have been very low. My response has been, why didn't we hear sound, at least the rush of air over an aerodynamic surface? If the craft were a large jet in glide with engines idling, we would have heard the engines. He then goes on to state, and again, he's coming from a skeptical approach, this sighting of the flying wing was classified as an example of a Class A, and then he puts in parentheses, incredible sighting. Why? Because there was a low, heavy overcast, which places an upper limit on the altitude of the object, because there was a reasonable estimate of the angular width of the light configuration that he was observing as it departed, and because there were 3 witnesses for verification. This must be called an incredible sighting. No other classification is reasonable. In this case, and I love this statement, the observer need not have a PhD in physics to know that a very strange craft had passed overhead. So that's coming from someone that went down to debunk the UFO subject. Now, in some of the material that I've gathered over the years from aging researchers and so forth, which is one of the reasons I have such a large collection, one of the organizations in St. Louis, the UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis, this was actually the group out of which MUFON formed out of. Many people don't know that. This is Walt Andrus, who was a long-standing member and actually head of MUFON for many years. This is when it was the Midwest UFO Network before it became Mutual UFO Network. This is John Schuessler, another long-standing international director for the group. But because I had lectured in St. Louis, I knew some of these individuals. They had a board meeting back in 2005, and the meeting went something like this. We're all in our 70s and 80s and we're dying off. What are we going to do with all this UFO material? And someone luckily on the board said, well, what about Dave over in Illinois? He's doing a lot of historical research and he's amassing a lot of this material. So I went and collected all of their research files, all of their newspapers. It was like 4 SUV boxes, or 4 SUVs full of boxes of UFO material. I was like a kid on Christmas going through some of this stuff. But what was interesting is siphoning through and filtering through all of these papers. I found some very intriguing things. I found some trivial things that I discarded. But one thing that jumped out at me was this. UFO Study Group of Greater St. Louis report, UFO sighting report from December 19th, 1967. Now, what's intriguing about that is the year, but also what the witness described. Triangular UFO with windows on the side. Now, I decided that, isn't this interesting? What was more interesting is on the back side of this report form was a map showing where this UFO was supposedly sighted in 1967. It was sighted almost in the exact spot that the officer on January 5th, 2000 in Shiloh saw the UFO when we had that famous wave of sightings. So we have 2 triangular UFOs seen near Scott Air Force Base, one in 2000, one in 1967. I decided to try to track this witness down. I had a name, I had an address. Again, it was 44 years after the event, so sometimes as a UFO researcher, I'm investigating a case from 1950 right now. You're like chasing the Undertaker, as they like to say, trying to get a hold of these witnesses before they die. Found out the witness was still alive, he still lived in Southern Illinois, still stood by his account, was willing to talk, be videotaped, and he allows me to use his name. So what I want to do is share my interview, a segment of the interview with him, so you can hear in their own words, what these witnesses describe. And my friend Daryl Barker, friend and colleague Daryl Barker, helped me videotape this back in 2012. But something that I would like to mention about this case, when I first reached out to the gentleman, first by email, then by phone, his first comment to me was, Dave, where did you hear about this? And I said, well, you filled out a sighting report, and I was going through some old files, and I came across your name. And he goes, I didn't file a sighting report. I said, yes, you did. He goes, no, I didn't. And my intent was not to get this guy incensed at me. My goal was to sit down and try to talk to him. So I just said, well, that's fine. I said, let's get together, let's schedule a time, and we'll do the interview. We conduct the interview that you'll see here, segments of it, and then afterwards, he again said, I still don't know how you found out about this. I said, well, John, I said, you filled out a sighting report back in '69. And he goes, no, I didn't. And so I take the report, push it over to him, flip to the second page where it says signature of witness. I said, is that your signature? His wife's sitting there, Daryl's sitting here across their kitchen table. He looks at her, looks at the paper, looks at me, looks back at the paper, looks at her again, in about 2 seconds, he goes, I'll be damned if I remember filling out a sighting report, but he goes, that's my signature. So he had completely forgotten about ever filling out a sighting report. I mean, he had literally moved on with his life, had forgotten about the incident, although he did remember the sighting itself. So I just want to mention that. And the other intriguing thing is because we have the passage of 44 years, and this report that was filed, in 68, it was actually filed in January of 68, I'm sitting there and I'm interviewing him, and I'm looking at his answers from 1968, and point for point, it was consistent in his testimony. So if he was lying 44 years ago, you think somewhere there's going to be a variance in that story. And I even tried to mislead him with questions, and he stuck right to the script that was in the sighting report that he had even forgot about filing. So let me just share with you a segment of this interview, let you hear it in his own words.
Okay, it was after dark, it was late in the evening, I'm not sure now the time. We were westbound on Highway 177 from Mascoutah to Belleville. We were right at the east edge of Belleville on 177. There's a tavern right there, I believe called Lone Oak Tavern, something like that on 177. And we had right in that area when one of us noticed the object in the sky.
Mm-hmm. And then could you just describe the object when you noticed it, and then did it change in appearance in any way, shape, or form as you were obviously viewing it from different vantage points?
Yes. Always seemed to be in the shape of a slice of pie to me. Just that with those dimensions had some thickness to it and an obvious triangular shape.
Okay. And you mentioned that there were some lights or windows as you
There was a
described?
row of lights along one side. There was only one side visible at a time anyway. The row of lights were square. The lights were square,
Okay.
or rectangular anyway.
Okay.
Time because it was moving all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of hampered because we didn't have a straight line way to follow it. We had to zigzag.
And obviously you described it visually. What type of noise did you hear?
Absolutely silent. There wasn't a sound. There was no sound at all.
Can you describe just the general terrain back at that time?
I would say now where there's so many subdivisions around the east end of Belleville, it was just all open fields.
Yep. So just to recap, the direction you saw it coming from would have been
From the southwest going to the northeast,
okay.
basically.
Okay. I believe you stated that you went to Scott Air Force Base?
Yes, there were a few fellows sitting in there, and I said, we've just been chasing a thing from something flying from Belleville towards Scott, wondering if you guys had anything on radar, if you had spotted anything also. And they said no. They said, well, where did you see it? We told them the direction it was flying, and they talked amongst themselves, and they said no, we had nothing. I had lived on Air Force bases my whole life, pretty much. I was born at Lackland Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas.
And so you've been more than familiar, and you've had plenty of experience seeing conventional military aircraft over the years.
Absolutely. Bombers and air refuelers. For 4 years at Scott, we lived in Honolulu, and there was a lot of air traffic there. There was a lot of airplanes. Hickam Air Force Base, very busy Air Force Base. Maxwell Air Force Base in Arkansas, very busy Air Force Base. And of course here at Scott, a lot of air traffic.
Hypothetically, if there was a skeptic sitting here right now and they said, you just simply misidentified as a conventional military aircraft, what would be your response to someone making that statement?
Well, I would, except for a few things, I would say, sure, could be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I'd sure like to see what you're talking about that is, of that shape and is silent,
Right.
That was the kicker for me.
And I do, and again, you kind of reiterate what you reported back in '68, because if you notice on the report form there, you said no sound.
None.
In response to the question, was there any noise?
Not a hum.
And you underlined it twice.
Yeah, no noise.
So in the literal sense of the term, you saw an unidentified flying object.
Absolutely, and still to this day unidentified as far as I'm concerned.
I want to thank John for letting me use his name. Sometimes we have to reference these witnesses, but we're not allowed to use the name. I like you to hear it in his own words. One important thing, though, because I recently was watching a documentary series where they had one of the arch skeptics on there, and they said, well, there's this thing called confirmation bias. People go out looking for UFOs, and when they see a light in the sky, it confirms their already preconceived belief, and therefore they report it as a UFO. You heard John 44 years later. He still says it's unidentified. He's not saying it's alien spacecraft. He actually thought it might have been something military, which is why, as you heard, he went to Scott Air Force Base, see if they knew anything about this thing. Same holds true for the police officers in 2000. None of them described what they saw as an alien spacecraft. They all thought, in practical terms, this was something military that Scott Air Force Base must be flying. So they always throw that out there, even though they've never taken the time to interview the actual eyewitnesses, but I have, and get an understanding of what their preconceived beliefs are regarding UFOs. A lot of the police officers I've interviewed stated, I never believed in UFOs before, but I saw something and I don't know what it was. Again, not leaping to the conclusion it's extraterrestrial. So that's interesting. Now, in analyzing the hundreds of UFO reports on these triangular UFOs, I found that there appear to be about 20 common characteristics. I think it's important that we try to create a working profile. Nobody, to my understanding, had done this yet with this specific subset of UFOs. There's 10 primary and 10 secondary characteristics. We're going to just quickly go through these in the interest of time. And with each one, I'd like to share with you another triangular UFO case from the history, just to show you the geographic distribution. Beams of light emitted, this typically breaks down into two categories. The spotlight, as we saw Lee Spiegel in the Lumberton, North Carolina incident, where the spotlight shone down on him and the police officers. In other instances, such as the Belgian wave, beams of light being seen to either shoot across the sky or shoot downward, red or other colored, narrow pencil-like beams of light. This was an incident in the UK, in England, in 1978, where a motorist had this triangular UFO fly over, and you can see a UFO shot a beam of light at our car. And there were multiple witnesses involved in this incident. 3 lights at each point. The one variable characteristic more than any other are the lighting characteristics, the lighting patterns. And sometimes as a witness is observing these objects, the lighting patterns will change, they'll shift. But the most prominent are these points of light at each point, 3 of them at each of the 3 points of the triangle. I love some of these newspaper archives. It gets very boring and tedious going through newspaper archives going back 50, 60, 70 years. But sometimes you find these little titles that make you laugh. It's unidentified flies but doesn't scare cops. It's just like, that's nice. It gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling. But in this particular instance, it says what they saw was a soundless triangular flying object twice the size of the full moon with a white light on each tip and red lights in the center. Quite often, in addition to the lights at each point, you'll have either a solitary or a cluster of red lights seen in the middle of the object. Same was the situation for the majority of the Belgian sightings. Another one, again, as we discussed, is the large size. An interesting account that transpired on May 16, 1977 in Memphis, Tennessee, was an incident involving multiple police officers, like the January 5th, 2000 case, that were in radio contact with one another. And they described this large triangular object. What's interesting in this report is the fact that one of the officers was talking to the other police officer on the radio channel. They said suddenly another group on the other end of town, a tactical team, calls in and says, that UFO that you sighted, is it triangular? And they said at that point we knew that they saw what we did because up to that point we didn't describe the shape. And they said, well, we're seeing a triangular object on this end of town. And multiple police officers, including civilians, saw this large triangular object in Memphis, Tennessee in 1977. The ability to hover. Here we go. This is 1960. Triangle spaceship is sighted. Los Angeles is excited over mystery object in morning sky. It involves a police officer and a civilian seeing a flying saucer, triangular. Back then they would call everything a flying saucer, even if it was shaped differently. But hovering about 300 to 400 feet above the Douglas aircraft plant in Santa Monica. So some of these objects will be seen to hover for seconds, anywhere up to a half hour in some instances. The 2 gendarmes on the first night of the Belgian wave saw this UFO hovering over Lake Gillespie for about 30 minutes, and then they saw a secondary UFO rising up, which we'll talk about momentarily. The ability to make the flat turns, as I described earlier. There was a case in Cleveland, Ohio in 1953 where a radio station manager stepped outside to have a cigarette, And I always like to say, thank goodness for cigarettes in the respect that we've had more UFO sightings over the years because people step outside at night to have a cigarette, and that's when they see a UFO. This was one of those particular instances. In 1953, radio station manager stepped outside on the building where the station was, and he observed this triangular object that made a flat pivot turn and then disappeared in an opposite direction. Silent flight, you heard that mentioned a number of times. Mr. John Olak described that with his sighting. 1960, flying triangle seen in state, and again, they described this object making radical maneuvers, starting, stopping, accelerating very rapidly from a dead stop, making no sound. And that was the thing that he said more than anything. He said eerie, no noise. He said that was the eeriest part of the whole thing, was seeing this object. And again, you look at this sketch from 1960, it bears striking similarities to what was later being reported from 89 to 91. Slow speed. Many of these witnesses, especially in the Hudson Valley wave, they stated that they could walk down the sidewalk and keep up with the object as it was flying. Very slow maneuvering. Not enough like a conventional aircraft to maintain airlift. But this was one seen in the California area, and they described numerous objects being seen to move slowly. It says here, the UFO over Auburn was about 13 to 14 minutes before 10 p.m. It was 30 to 40 miles per hour and at least 400 to 500 feet high. Describe the object as triangular and silent. So you see how these recurring descriptions play out time and time again. Low altitude flight. This was a very significant wave of sightings that I'm still trying to find additional news stories from the time period. But in November of '74, both the United States and Canada were experiencing a wave of UFO sightings. This is what's important. The object was tracked on radar and chased unsuccessfully by two F-106 flight interceptors. Again, one of the radar cases that we have in conjunction with eyewitness testimony. Hundreds of sightings came to police as the object reportedly cruised, often at treetop level, over the U.S. and Canada. Again, low altitude sightings. Several described it as having a triangular shape. So radar confirmation, triangular reports, 1974. Another one, sharp turns at high speed, another military case involving radar. We had jet interceptors dispatched by the Chilean military. In December 1978 and in May of 1979, two incidents occurred where this played out. Objects being tracked on radar and interceptors being sent up. The objects were being visually seen as well as tracked on radar and made fast, evasive maneuvers and shot off where the jets were basically, left trailing. Rapid acceleration, 1954. This is going way back. Flying triangle hovers over Cobalt. 1954 Toronto telegram. And this described a mining town, mining area. The Cobalt area has a lot of extensive mines, and multiple UFOs were being seen at the time, but in this particular instance, they described a flying triangle that was hovering silently. Secondary characteristics. These are those that play out, but not as prevalent as the primary ones. Associated sounds. Quite often they're silent, but sometimes you'll hear a low humming or droning sound associated with these triangular objects. Humming UFO sighted by family over Verona, Kentucky. And there's a description of the triangle. Observed with non-triangular UFOs. If you recall the January 5th incident, I stated we had additional eyewitness testimony that came forward. And whereas we thought it was one triangular object, we now think there were two triangular objects and a rectangular object being reported. In Mahopac Falls, New York in 1984, there was a mother and a daughter driving home, and they saw a triangular UFO. They pulled into their driveway, exited the vehicle to get the husband's attention to come out and take a look at the object. The triangular UFO had disappeared, but it was replaced by this rectangular UFO that was sighted hovering over the neighborhood. What's intriguing is, on the Belgian wave, in November 29, 1989, where the two gendarmes saw the objects over Lake Chalepe, they contacted the dispatcher, Albert Kreutz, in Yupon, and asked him to go out and see if he could see the objects. He exited out to the balcony of the police department, and he saw not a triangular object, but rather a rectangular object. This is his actual sketch. So we have two instances separated by 5 years across the Atlantic describing triangular UFOs being sighted with rectangular UFOs. Strange though it may seem, this was again playing out January 5th, 2000. We had triangular UFOs, and one witness describing and sketching an object very similar to that. So, very unusual characteristics. Electromagnetic effects. Back in the 50s and 60s, we had a prevalence of UFO reports where if they were low enough, they would tend to stall automobile engines or cause radio interference. The vast majority of the triangular UFOs, we don't have that. We don't have engine stalling, we don't have electromagnetic interference, but there are a handful of accounts. There was one in Japan where a wedding planner was arriving at a location, a reception hall, and she saw a triangular UFO, and as reported in the news, and Omar Fowler quoted this in his research, neighbors in the area reported that they were having television interference. And whether or not that was related, we don't know, but it was right at the same time as the triangular UFO being reported in that area. Multiple triangular UFOs being seen. If you recall, I stated earlier that oftentimes they're seen in pairs or groups, not just one solitary UFO. This is one from the International News Service from 1954. 300 West Berliners report today to have seen 3 triangular-shaped flying saucers on several occasions during the past few weeks. Rudolf Hermes, director of Tippelhoff Airport, Berlin, said all the witnesses described the objects as shiny. He said they claimed the saucer seemed to pull away with incredible speed and in a zigzag motion. American and British officials have begun an investigation. But when you go through the British files and the American files, you see no evidence of an investigation that took place. Glowing underside. As I mentioned, quite often you have the lights, the 3 points of light as a common characteristic. Sometimes there's a complete absence of lights, and rather you have the underside bathed in this glowing light. One witness described on January 1st in 1980 in Missouri, it was almost like a blue electrical arc that was sweeping across the bottom side of the object, but he could not discern any specific lights. And this one, they described a large triangular-shaped object which had a reddish-orange glow to the entire thing.
I've seen that.
So sometimes you don't see lights. Erratic movement, Big Mac attack, UFO circles, East Rome restaurant. Employees at a McDonald's actually observed a triangular UFO that was circling town and making these erratic maneuvers, unlike linear flight that you'd think characteristic of conventional aircraft. Blunt in forward movement. Remember the report from the 50s, investigators noted that oftentimes these objects seem to be flying backwards. This was a case from Project Blue Book files. This is a sketch from witnesses. Notice the 3 points of light, triangular object, and these are the arrows in the report indicating direction of movement. So again, very unusual common characteristics that play out. That was from 67. Detachable lights and objects. If you remember the Danish wave, the witness described the dark triangular object and horseshoe-shaped objects coming out. We have reports of objects coming out of these objects and also going in. In this particular instance, this was a teacher with some students after a basketball game. They were leaving. They saw an object. It was described as triangular in shape with white and orange lights, and a second object appeared to emerge from it. The objects were observed by the group for about 10 minutes, and they said it was definitely not a plane or star, and it moved in an erratic manner. So again, indicating erratic maneuvering. Then we have shape-shifting. This is one of the more anomalous characteristics. People often ask me, you say that some of these might be military, some of these might be something else. How do you discern the two? This is one of those unusual characteristics that we have in the files, where an object will be sighted in broad daylight, triangular in shape, and suddenly it morphs or changes right before the eyewitness. This is one that we actually recreated for the Smithsonian Channel. They did a pretty good job overall, but this was in the report on unidentified flying objects by Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. I also pulled the original Project Blue Book case file. And this involved an F-86 Saberjet pilot, January 28, 1953, flying a solo mission, clear skies. He observed this very bright orange-white light, and it kept alternating, white, orange, white, orange. He saw that above him, and he had some time, so he thought, that's very unusual. At first he thought it might be a planet, but he wanted to get a closer look. He said the thing that was unusual, it had a very sharp circular outline to it. So he decided, well, I'll increase altitude. If it's something in the atmosphere, it should get larger in my windscreen. If it doesn't, then it's probably a star or a planet. He increased altitude, and within minutes, the light that was above him was now below him, which immediately ruled out Venus or the moon. He then began to descend and close on the UFO, and in the actual report from Project Blue Book, he stated that the light alternated, and then the light right before his eyes changed from a light to an equilateral triangle. And then, if that's not strange enough, the triangle then divided into 2 triangles, which shot off in different directions. Again, not a career-advancing move for a pilot in 1953, right, John, to report something like that. So, but that is part of the official Blue Book documentation. Superstructure observed, January 1972, Bartelso, Illinois. A teenage couple were driving and saw this large triangular object off in the distance that suddenly shot directly over their vehicle. They accelerated, I believe, up to about 85 miles per hour, and this object kept up with them. As they looked up, they could see lights, and they could discern what they described, similar to what we see here with these lights, some type of scaffolding or superstructure on the underside. And I've had numerous individuals contact me in other accounts where they describe this superstructure on the underside of the aircraft or vehicle. And that certainly doesn't seem like conventional aircraft. I mean, it's not like our 737s that have that sleek aerodynamic design to it. So again, what type of propulsion is being employed with these objects that they have some type of structure like that? So those are the 20 common characteristics. We did a quick review. I do a deep dive in my book about each of these and looking at other patterns in the data. But the one thing I like to say is, again, hopefully this illustrates in just the short time we've been talking, that there is a rich history of these sightings. This didn't start with the advent of stealth technology. These reports go back, there's worldwide distribution, and not just the United States military, but military and government agencies worldwide have been documenting and chronicling these events. But to answer the question as far as, well, what's the oldest case you have on record, Dave? That's the question I always get asked. I'll defer to the documentary here, and then we'll wrap up after this. This was a very nice recreation of the earliest case I had. It will say 1882, but in point of fact, it was published in 1882, and it actually occurred in 1881. But with that, let me just share this video clip with you. I thought they did a very good job.
From the recent sightings in Belgium, England, and the United States, to the accounts investigator David Marler has uncovered in the 1940s and 50s, black triangles appear to be a phenomenon that stretches back decades. Marler's investigation leads him further into the past.
In doing a comprehensive review of newspaper archives, I started coming across cases dating back further and further, and then finding other documentation of cases going back to the late 19th century. It really begs the question, what are we dealing with here?
The most prestigious scientific journals of the 19th century contain numerous reports of strange, black triangular objects in the sky. This is decades before the first planes ever flew.
The earliest account I have is 1882, that was observed and documented in Scientific American.
July 3rd, 1882, Lebanon, Connecticut. Two astronomers making observations of the moon witness a strange sight.
The UFOs that were reported were seen moving over the surface of the moon by astronomers, and they described not one but two triangular dark objects moving over the lunar surface.
The astronomers' report states they see two black triangular notches on the lower half of the moon. They move toward each other along the moon's edge and seem to be obliterated nearly a quarter of its surface. In the report, they offer no suggestion as to what these triangular objects could be. This is one of the earliest reports of a triangular UFO. It predates manned flight by over 2 decades. And there are more reports. In the scientific journal Nature, a writer describes seeing a stationary dark patch in the sky. It is fan-shaped and held its position for more than half an hour. Marler's investigation uncovers reports from all around the world. Flying triangles capable of controlled flight and able to ascend high into the clouds. The descriptions of black triangles in the 19th century are similar to the descriptions in modern times.
So, just want to share that with you. I thought they did a pretty good job recreating that. I had a reference to this particular article that said it was 1882, but after this was actually filmed, I was able to obtain an original copy from 1882, and it referenced that it was actually April, and this was January, so clearly it was April of the preceding year. That's why there was a little discrepancy on the 1-year time frame there. But my conclusions, the triangles are nothing new. I think we can demonstrate, at least that the reports have been out there for many, many decades, if not hundreds of years. Triangles have been ever present in the UFO data. Reports appear to be consistent in their detailed narratives and putting all these common characteristics together. And I think that this bolsters the idea we're dealing with a tangible reality. This is not hallucinatory, especially when we factor in the radar confirmation cases. And whatever this is, it's something that's not clearly understood. And the culmination of my research is my book, Triangular UFO'S, and Estimate of the Situation. I tried to do the best job I could. This is my first book. I never thought I'd actually write a book on the subject of UFOs, but here it is. And this is a rare opportunity. I do a lot of lectures for school groups, organizations, as well as UFO conferences. And I'd just like to give a shout out. The foreword was done by John Alexander, who is actually here in the audience. So first time I have a chance to publicly thank him for writing the foreword. And the nice thing about John is, I'd like to describe John as he's not someone that suffers fools. We tend to agree on a lot regarding the UFO subject. There's a lot of questionable characters within the UFO research community that often quote things or throw things out there without clarifying and verifying the information. And John saw value in my research, and we started a collaborative sharing of information. And I asked if he'd be kind enough to write the foreword of my book, which he did, and would like to just publicly thank him for that. I want to thank you for your time. If we have any time, we can, I guess, open it up for questions. Would that be okay?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to the triangle thing. I seen the documentary about the Phoenix Lights, and it said that it began the first sightings were over Black Mountain here in
Correct.
Henderson.
Correct.
And then it went over Boulder City, and that's where it started.
It was a long flight trajectory that then, started up towards the north end and ultimately terminated down around Tucson, where the last sighting reports. But it involved hundreds of eyewitnesses. Now, we can't say what this object was, but based on the size and, again, the flight characteristics, it was something highly unusual. One of the biggest misperceptions with that case, though, is you consistently, and I blame a lot of the production teams for this, they will show this video of lights, over the mountain range. And they'll say that this was an example of the Phoenix Lights. In my estimation, and there'll be UFO investigators, maybe people are going to disagree with me, those were flares being dropped over the Berry Goldwater test range. And the reason I say that is that happened about 40 to 45 minutes after the object in question flew overhead. Now, what's interesting is when you look at the initial news reports, and we have all of this, we can show you this, the local news started covering the story. And the initial news segment stated, we contacted Luke Air Force Base, and they denied having any military operations at the time. And then about 45 minutes after that or so, then all of a sudden they start dropping the flares over the Berry Goldwater test range. And that's quite often what you see in that video. Now, some people say that those were the Phoenix Lights. I disagree with that based on the testimony when you really dive into the case. But I throw this out just as sheer speculation. It's almost as if you had a credible sighting of an object cited by hundreds of people in the greater Phoenix area, not to mention north of Phoenix, as you mentioned, all the way down to Tucson. And I have to at least wonder, just bear with me while I just kind of go down the path of speculation, which I often don't do. You almost wonder that some military person didn't contact another military person and say, we need plausible deniability. Get some A-10 warthogs, drop some flares, and then we can use that as an excuse. And later, despite the initial comment on the part of the military, where they said there were no military operations, later they said, oh, well, we were dropping flares over the Berry Goldwater test range. The problem is the time frame. It was 45 minutes after the sightings had concluded over Phoenix. So the time didn't match up.
And for them saying that and doing what they did with the flares, I think that even makes the sighting more credible.
Well,
they're trying to cover something up.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the Hudson Valley Wave that we talked about from 83 to 86, a similar scenario played out. We had police officers and hundreds of eyewitnesses reporting these large triangular, or actually very similar chevron-shaped objects like the Phoenix Lights that were sighted over the Hudson Valley area of New York and Connecticut. And those sightings were reported. Shortly thereafter, private pilots who were never identified were flying in tight formation with an array of lights on their Cessnas, replicating the sightings. What's interesting is the media jumped on that and said, well, we clearly have an explanation for the UFO sightings. The problem is we have numerous eyewitnesses on record, and I talked to some of the investigators that investigated this back in the 80s. You have witnesses that saw the UFOs and then a week or so later saw the planes, and they said there's no comparison. The object, when we saw the planes, we knew they were planes. They sounded like 3 or 4 or 5 Cessnas flying overhead. The lights we saw previously made no sound. And the other thing they also noticed were they could tell that the formation of lights would shift slightly, like planes flying in formation. They said the objects, or the lights they saw, were fixed, and they could even see structure around the lights, and it moved in unison. There was no maneuvering or free motion associated with the individual lights. So I find it interesting, to your point, yeah, you have to certainly question, doesn't that add validity? And also with the Phoenix Lights case, beyond the triangle that was being seen, and we talked about triangles being sighted with other UFOs, there were also balls of light that were seen hovering outside of Luke Air Force Base that shot off, and F-16s were then dispatched supposedly after the objects. So we definitely have what appears to be documented military interest in those sightings on that particular night.
Yeah.
But very interesting. Yes?
Several years ago in Las Vegas, they had crash retrieval conferences, and one of the last ones, I believe Kerry Cassidy and her partner spoke about a whistleblower who said he and they were involved in a secret black project triangle that could levitate and go out in outer space in a matter of seconds. I was just wondering if you were aware of this story, statement, and if you run across any of these black project.
I've heard the stories. There's certainly, as you know, with UFOs, there's lots of stories and rumors circulating, but it's really hard to pin those down. The issue I have, and especially with like the TR-3B, not to say that it doesn't exist, I don't know. Let me be very matter of fact on that. But the problem is you have these individuals that come forward claiming to have worked on these compartmentalized classified projects. And again, we're very close to Area 51 here in Nellis, so there might be people in the audience that would silently agree with me on this. There's a reason that you sign these confidentiality agreements. I mean, you are under threat of prison time, fines, pensions being revoked. And yet, we have these whistleblowers supposedly coming forward, going to UFO conferences or putting that information out there saying, I worked on those projects. Let me tell you about the UFOs we have that we've created. And by the way, let me tell you how they fly. Anybody that is working on compartmentalized projects that leaks that information, they're going to be in jail. And I've had people say, oh, but if they jail them, then all that does is just bolster the fact that they were telling the truth. Well, so they don't arrest them, they don't do anything. Well, then you can't hold anybody to secrecy oaths if you're going to go down that line of thought. These people, if they leak information, and again, I've talked to people at Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and
Won't have a job.
they're going to be in prison. They're not going to be lecturing at UFO conferences or disseminating information. Not to say that they couldn't have leaked information. I'm not saying that. Again,
She was reporting on a whistleblower that she had talked to in an interview. I just wondered if you had talked to her about this.
No, but I've heard the stories, and I've heard, again, about the TR-3B. The fact is, we don't have any tangible evidence any more than we have tangible evidence of UFOs being extraterrestrial in that sense as far as the hard evidence. So it really, I leave it up to everyone else to make up their mind as far as the whistleblower statements and the comments. I would like to think that we do have some radical aircraft, and again, that's why I can see that some of these triangular objects within the last 15 to 20 years, let's say, could be some of our technology that people are seeing. But when you start going back, and as I like to say, I don't have hard evidence that I can nail down. We don't with the UFO subject. But I like to think, rather than taking a scientific argument, I make a historical argument. And I don't think you can arbitrarily say all reports of triangles from 1989 forward are legitimate, but anything before that is not legitimate. I think that's an arbitrary mindset or approach to have. If we see that there is a history of these reports beyond just triangular objects, the lighting, the flight characteristics, the dynamics associated with these craft, then I think we have to concede, and I think John agrees with me on this, that especially when you're looking at reports before powered flight even existed, are some of these things someone else's technology? And I pose it as a question, not as a definitive statement, but I would hypothesize that perhaps some of these things are someone else's technology.
I have maybe can link a little bit, starting to come together here. I got a really good friend that worked out at the test site. He did construction, and his dad was a nuclear physicist. I guess he was one of the top ones, and he's since died. Mm-hmm. But he tells me this crazy story one day, and he swore to it, and I'm like, okay, whatever. He tells me that the Close Encounters of the Third Kind, his movie was actually based on a real event. It's not exactly how it happened, but it was just based upon a true event. And he said, but it didn't actually take place in Wyoming. He swore to me that it took place at Black Mountain in Henderson, behind Black Mountain. Okay. He said, behind Black Mountain, there's some big thing, and nobody's allowed to go back. So nobody really knows what's behind there. But he swore to me that the movie, that something similar to that happened behind Black Mountain, and that's what that movie is based upon. And I thought he was crazy when he's telling me this, but now thinking about it, with the Phoenix Lights case, that's where it was first seen, was coming out of Black Mountain.
I've heard a similar
And the
story.
special ops, as this gentleman said,
Yeah.
there might be a link there
There could be.
that nobody's looked into.
I've heard a similar story, but I've heard it linked to a different location. So, you know, who
Yeah.
knows? I've heard it linked to White Sands, New Mexico, actually. That
Oh, yeah.
out in White Sands, there was a location where they had an array of lights set up, and they were able to actually
Yeah,
signal
well, when
these
he told me Black Mountain, that's the first time I've ever heard that mentioned in any UFO thing. But I started thinking about it, and it is it's pretty weird over there.
It's weird, and
You know, and
stories
that's
like
where that
you
Phoenix
know,
Light ship was. Did it come from there? I mean,
It's possible.
yeah,
And-
nobody's ever investigated Black Mountain.
As a researcher, you know, when we hear these rumors, we hear these stories, about all we can do is really take it down, and
Yeah,
we have a gray file, and we just drop it in there.
But he's one of the most honest persons I know, and he was getting pretty mad at me. He was like, "I'm telling you the truth." I was
Yeah.
like, "Come on, you're crazy." This is
Yeah.
like, I know I was, I worked there. He said.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
I have to give him the benefit of the doubt.
As you all know better than anybody here, I mean, living here in Las Vegas, there's a lot of stories surrounding Area 51.
Yeah.
You know, so who knows? I mean, it's a big question mark.
There might be more than, that place around. There's probably places everywhere we don't know about. And I would say, I would be pretty sure Black Mountain's probably the next place that might find out some weird stuff's going on over there. You never know.
I'll look into that.
Yeah,
and see.
if you could, that would be great, because
Yeah.
I believe the guy, he's one of the most honest guys I know.
Yeah.
He would never make up a story like
Yeah,
that.
and that was in confidence to you, just
Yeah.
man to man. It
Yeah.
wasn't like he was out spouting that.
Yeah,
or
and
posting
his
it on the
dad had
internet.
told him a few things on his deathbed and all that, and confirmed it, and, I just have to believe him. He's a pretty honest guy.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, it's one of those things we take down and then we wait to see if maybe we find other supporting evidence or information that links it to it.
Yeah, for him to swear to that, I mean, I mentioned Bigfoot, and he thinks I'm an idiot, so.
Have you spoken to anybody from the Belgian Air Force or the Belgian Wave?
Not the Belgian Air Force. My main point of contact has been Patrick Farron in Brussels, and he knows General de Brouwer. They're good friends, and so I've kind of indirectly have dealt with him. And General de Brouwer is getting up there in age now, but I would like to actually go to Belgium and actually meet with him at some point if I had that opportunity. But they were in cooperation, working in cooperation with the Belgian military, which was really unheard of. I mean, in the United States, usually there's no level of cooperation, or something uncommon is all we receive. And to see that level of cooperation between civilian UFO researchers and the Belgian military, it was unprecedented. Yes.
We now have multi-megapixel high-resolution digital cameras. Are there any high-resolution photographs of these objects? Yes.
Are you asking or telling me?
Have you in your records, or have you seen any?
Again, when it comes to photo and video evidence, I'm not an expert. There's certainly a lot that's circulating out there, but until I can get the funding to enlist a professional analyst, I'm just not going to go through those photos, because there's just so much right now. As I like to say, technology is a double-edged sword. Yes, we have high-resolution cameras, but we also have Photoshop and digital manipulation software to where, seeing is not, you can buy a green screen now and put it in your home, and you can superimpose footage of the Normandy invasion, and you can be standing there in a uniform, and it looks like you're at Normandy,
With Bigfoot.
Yeah, with Bigfoot. So it's just, unfortunately, it's just not an area of my expertise, but if I could enlist the help, if there's anyone here, I always throw that out there. If there's any photo or video analysts that would like to systematically start going through and culling through the multitude of videos, because there's just so much out there that's out on the internet. I'm just not qualified, to be quite honest with you, to weigh in on the photo and the video evidence.
I was thinking in terms of these police officers who were the witnesses of a lot
Right.
of these things.
And in that particular instance, we didn't go into detail. The one officer did actually try to take a picture of the object, but all he had was a Polaroid camera in the trunk of his squad car. That was Officer Craig Stevens in Millstadt. And he snapped the picture, but for anybody that used to use the old Polaroids like me, for any old school people here, they're not designed for nighttime photography, first off. And second off,
The image is going to be this big.
exactly. And they're not good cameras for nighttime photography. And second of all, the object was moving away at that point. And the other factor was it was an extremely cold night, and it was in the trunk of his squad car. So it wasn't within normal operating temperatures to even be taking a picture. But he at least made an attempt. I give him credit for that. But something to go back to the Phoenix Lights, my argument is this. I think the best thing that we could have happen is to have the Phoenix Lights case, or one similar to it, happen today to tie in exactly what you're describing. We all have cameras now. In 1997, that was not the case.
Yeah.
And I think, based on the history, it's just a matter of time.
Before it happens.
I really do. I think it's just a matter of time before we have another Phoenix Lights type event happen, and we have hundreds of people with their iPhones, their Androids, that are going to film it from multiple angles, and I'm waiting for that. I'm waiting for that day when that's going to happen. And then I think that's when photo and video evidence suddenly raises the bar, because now you have corroborative testimony and footage shot from multiple angles. If that incident would have occurred today, we wouldn't even be arguing about the UFO phenomenon today, as far as I'm concerned. I think that would have been, irrefutable evidence that something unusual was flying in our skies. Yes?
Are you familiar with Dr. Lear's Turkey UFO video?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm familiar with Dr. Roger Lear. Are you talking about Roger Lear?
Yeah.
I know about his implant research, but not his turkey. Is it turkey?
Yeah, it's a video of a UFO he captured in Turkey.
Oh, in Turkey. I thought you were of a turkey.
No.
How's the turkey?
That's an IFO, identified flying object.
It clearly shows ports or windows on the side of the craft with what looks like beings inside of these windows.
Did
I
he
haven't
shoot
seen
that
that.
video himself?
Yes.
That's where he shot that? I've seen
I
that.
believe so, yeah. I was just wondering if you were familiar with that video. What your
I
thoughts
haven't.
were.
I'd actually like to see that, because I was recently, within the last year, contacted by a retired law enforcement officer in the Midlands over in England who claimed to have seen this triangular UFO several years ago, and he sketched it out and described windows on the side, like John Olak described, the witness from 1967, but he also described girders on the underside, like the other witnesses described, and he said he saw figures in the windows. He
Right.
didn't speculate they were alien. He
Right.
just said, I saw a humanoid figure. It could have been military, I don't know, but
Right.
I saw figures walking back and forth behind these
Yeah,
windows.
The humanoids looked awfully like your conventional UFO entity that you would probably think of.
Agreed.
I seen that video. I don't know how they could have faked that. That looked really authentic,
Yeah,
that video.
I mean, if you can get my email later, if you could find the link and shoot it over to me, I'd
That's a
appreciate
good
it.
video.
I'd love to see. I haven't seen that. Again, there's just so many out there, and
Right.
and it's just so much material to sift through. Yes.
I saw this video, awfully grainy. Of course, if somebody says, look, yeah.
This video that we're referencing?
It's all over the internet.
Okay.
Very, very, very grainy. It's at nighttime. And, of course, if you stretch your imagination, you could see anything.
Okay.
That doesn't mean I'm against
Right.
what he has.
But you'd like to see better clarity in the
I
video.
am just saying that it's extremely grainy and shady. So let's propose then that you have two scenarios. The first scenario is they're ours. Super secret. So let's tackle this. Super secret hours. Why fly low with lights? Doesn't make sense. Number one.
I agree.
Two, they're not ours, but they appear. Why aren't they being chased down and shot at?
Mhm.
So these are the questions that, what about altercations? Has any of these officers or any of these near military bases that have had any kind of contact or try to shoot them down?
Right.
Do you have any reports of that? Or officers that got so scared that they start shooting and trying to defend themselves?
I've heard anecdotal stories, but nothing that I would be willing to get up here and talk about, because I haven't been able to verify it through official, newspapers or military reports, etc. I've heard rumors, but I really don't want to get up and lecture based on rumor, because I don't want to deceive you any more than deceive myself. But I will say, though, that, the first part, that has been a question that's been posed. If these are top secret military objects, well, they're not top secret if they're lighting them up like Christmas trees and flying them at low altitude. The other thing is this, that we really have no credible reports, and this is something John and I have discussed with his military background. We have no credible reports of these triangular UFOs being seen in military operations areas. If they're military aircraft, as John points out, military aircraft are built with a purpose. It's a purpose-driven project. Why are these built if they're just cavorting around the skies over civilian populations? Why aren't we seeing them in Afghanistan? Why aren't we seeing them in Iraq? And why are we dealing with seemingly inferior technologies if we have these triangles that can fly rings around anything?
Or
So,
why are they flying around Jupiter or Saturn instead of of low altitude, you know, around Phoenix.
And the only other thing I would add to the second part of that is, as far as the objects being chased or shot at, it's quite possible that those incidents could have occurred. I'm not going to say they have, I have no evidence to support that, but if something like that did occur, there's a good chance that we would never even hear about it. I mean, most of these military accounts, by virtue of the dates, these are 20, 30, 40 years old, so they've declassified these. We don't know what may have occurred 5 years ago or 5 months ago. And only with the passage of time do these things usually pan out. And that's why I like focusing on the historical cases also, because let's be honest, unless anybody's here from Area 51 today, which they might be, we don't know what the cutting edge technology is. But when we look back to the 40s and the 50s or the 1800s, we can look back with a fair degree of certainty and know, okay, we couldn't do that. Our technology was not there at that point. So I think it's interesting to look at those cases, not because they're old, but because we do have a certain sense of what the technology was for that time.
Well,
Yes,
it's
sir.
just interesting that from your account, they're mostly being seen, from what I heard, around NATO.
Not in all cases. There's a high proportion, though, sighted near military. Yeah, there's been a lot that have been sighted out in the middle of cornfields, that have been sighted out in Kansas, over soybean fields, but there are a high percentage. In fact, NIDS, the organization that was based here in Las Vegas, their initial report was they were finding that there were a lot of reports congregating around military installations, and they surmised that perhaps these could be military. But then as additional data poured in, quite often we see this with UFO, investigators and researchers, you start to see a pattern, but then as more data comes in, you're like, that pattern doesn't hold up. In the 50s, for example, they found that there appeared to be higher incidence of flying saucers when Mars was in its closest, proximity to the Earth. So kind of naive looking back on it, they thought, oh, maybe they're Martians coming from Mars, and that's when they're making their visitations. But that actually played out for a number of years, but then over successive years, the pattern didn't hold. It just simply did not pan out. So they had to dismiss that. It's like, based on new information, that there doesn't appear to be a correlation there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so speaking of what you brought up about pursuit and being fired upon, and I got here a little bit late, so you might have already discussed this, but I was wondering if you'd heard anything about the Battle of Los Angeles, where they supposedly fired on these UFOs, and if there was any fallout from that, or do you have any kind of theories about that?
There's lots of theories. I've actually lectured on that case. That's an area where I've been extremely interested. In fact, in my home, I have numerous front page original newspapers going back to 1896. And I have all of the original local newspapers from that morning, February 25th, 1942. And what's interesting is I was also, in addition to getting the newspapers, I was able to obtain one of the original first run photographs, actual 8x10 photographs through the news service. And John's actually seen it at my home. And you see a lot of detail in there, but looking at that and looking at all of the reports, what's interesting is the object was tracked on radar coming in off the Pacific, moved in, traversed the greater LA area, then disappeared, came back, reverse direction about 20, 30 minutes later, and was fired on multiple times, and actually was seen to hover at times. But what was interesting is to obtain the original photo, which I have in my possession, and piecing all of this information together, it was something highly unusual. I actually, like any investigation, in my audience I lectured this to in Albuquerque about a year ago, we try to rule out all the conventional explanations. One could have been an anti-aircraft tethered balloon. And based on the flight and the wind speeds, it just doesn't match up.
They would have shot it down if it was a balloon.
It would have probably been ruptured based on the flak and all the chaff from the projectiles that were being shot at. It literally reversed direction, and it was seen to hover at times. And witnesses described that the object was hit or that there were explosions in close proximity to it. So balloon just simply doesn't add up. The Japanese were actually, I found a declassified document in a newspaper article that references the document. After the war, they talked to the Japanese about this incident, and they denied that there were any military operations near California or the California coast on that particular night. So there's no reason for them to lie. The war's over, so there was no documentation the Japanese were doing anything. If it was, say, a Japanese Zero, it would have probably been shot down. Or why did it fly over twice and not try to do any type of damage? It makes no sense. And then, you can look at other explanations, but nothing seems to pan out. And as I like to say, in my estimation, that is a genuine, unidentified flying object. No rational explanation can explain the events of that night. Now, some people say, well, it was all due to jittery war nerves. Again, you have skeptics that only focus on one element and then they attack that. How does that explain the radar target? How does that explain the object that they were tracking coming in off the Pacific coast prior to the sightings occurring? It simply doesn't add up. And why do we have a photograph of an anomalous object with multiple searchlights trained on it? That's not a hallucination.
Or our weapons having no effect on it.
Weapons
Why?
appear to
I
have
mean,
no
if it was
effect on it.
anything.
I'm sorry.
Is that the photo you have, the spotlight photo?
Correct. Yeah, I have one of the original. Correct.
Track range.
Well, mine's a lot clearer than the ones you typically see. It's pretty clear, and it's the original. I actually got it from the granddaughter of the photographer who supposedly took the picture, and it has the original Associated Press stamp, date, and teletype, news teletype. So
That's pretty cool.
And again, if there's any photo analysts out there, I'd love to have you dissect that because that's not my area of expertise. But I find that to be an extremely interesting case. The thing that's interesting about that is that was 5 years before Kenneth Arnold ever invented the term flying saucer. So again, going back to skeptical claims where, well, there's confirmation bias. You're looking for UFOs, so you see something and now it just confirms your preconceived belief. No one, let me emphasize, no one had the term flying saucer in their head during World War II. That was a non-issue. And at the time, rightly so, we thought this was the Japanese attacking. I mean, that was the mindset. And in point of fact, Project Blue Book in the early days, Project Sign and Project Grudge, when you look at the declassified meeting notes, they didn't think that these were extraterrestrial or interplanetary. They thought these were Soviet in origin, which was, again, the most practical explanation. But, with the passage of time, you keep seeing these reports, and it's like, if you can't explain it away as Soviet, if you can't explain it away as Japanese, if you can't explain it away as top secret military aircraft, then what are you left with? And the one thing I like to come back to is, let's all agree that these things are. We don't have to say what they are, but let's agree that these things exist and they need to be studied more thoroughly by people much more qualified than myself and other UFO researchers. I just wish that the scientific community would start embracing this subject and looking at the data. They pass judgments a priori without interviewing witnesses. They make comments about witnesses' character when they themselves haven't gone out and interviewed the witnesses. As I like to say, UFO researchers, we take the time and expense out of our own pocket to go out, document these events, document the eyewitness testimony, track down witnesses like John Olak 44 years later. In fact, I was just in Farmington, New Mexico. This is a whole other area of UFO research I'm doing currently. I tracked down a 92-year-old witness that was what the last surviving eyewitness mentioned to this 1950 incident over Farmington, New Mexico. He's 92 years old. And I'll be going up in 2 weeks to get a video deposition from him. Nobody has actually gone to interview any of these witnesses and get them on videotape, and he's the last surviving one mentioned in the newspaper. But, interview the witnesses before you pass judgment on them. Weigh the evidence before you make your judgments. And a lot of scientists and a lot of skeptics out there, they attack UFO researchers, and some need to be attacked. I attack fellow UFO researchers when I see there's errors in their logic or their judgment. But don't sit there and attack an individual that you've never interviewed, that you've never met, but I have. And don't pass judgment and throw rocks at an investigation when you haven't taken the time and expense to go out and do the investigation yourself. We go out and investigate, they sit on the sidelines and throw rocks at us. And then they have their little arrogant smirk because we don't have hard evidence. Well, we don't have hard evidence, but as I like to say, where there's smoke, there's fire, and with the UFO subject, there's a hell of a lot of smoke.
Well, I'll tell you, in most cases I've heard of these skeptics and people who are just making fun of, UFO believers, when the few that actually do go out and investigate it, in every case I've heard, they come back believers.
Well, we were talking about the physics professor.
Yeah, I think
Dr.
that should be enough right there to legitimize it to at least be looked into by mainstream science.
Yeah, exactly. And Dr. Harley Rutledge, he really was transformed by that sighting and by his investigations. And, we use the term believe. I don't like to use the term believe. It's more religious, faith-based. I like to think of the term acceptance. And just like any scientist, when you're looking at evidence, at some point you accept the idea that maybe this is the working hypothesis.
Yeah, maybe we don't know everything. There's more out there.
And, I just wish that we would start investigating the subject more thoroughly, because in my estimation, you have to be the harshest cynic. If you look at, let's look at all the cases we just talked about tonight. If you think that every one of these people misidentified or crazy, drunk, or insane, you're an extreme cynic to a great degree. And again, how does that explain landing trace cases? How does that explain radiation cases? How does that explain radar confirmation? When you look at the totality of information, it suggested that we're dealing with something. I don't know what that is. As investigators, we can say what things aren't, but we can't say what things are. So, any other questions? Yes.
In the few cases where radar confirmed what witnesses saw, did the radar data also corroborate the size that they were thinking they were seeing?
Not that I can recall. The cases that we have on file, I don't know if it was able to give an idea of size.
You can tell
Yeah.
a Cessna from a jumbo jet.
Right. The problem is we usually get the radar data secondhand. We don't have the raw data to where we can analyze it. Now the Belgians did, but they weren't. I don't believe they were able to estimate size on the F-16 radar data. But we've had on the Smithsonian Channel series, the episode I showed you, Black Triangles, they actually interviewed Eve Nielsberg, who was the pilot of the F-16. It's only one of 2 interviews that he's ever done. But he talks about the fact that 9 times he locked on to this UFO, and each time the object tore away at blistering speed, executing incredible flight maneuvers.
So they must have known he was locking on.
Well, one of the official explanations is that there were some type of electronic countermeasures that was being tested. But tested by who? And it's Belgium, who's really trying to violate Belgian airspace? They're not exactly, it's just ludicrous. I mean, some of the explanations that you get. And Eve was a seasoned pilot, and he stated, he goes, whatever I was locking onto, it was not some electronic countermeasures. It was a solid radar target. And the important thing, again, is when they talk about the F-16 pilot, explaining it all away, is that you have to look at there's different types of radar, and we had 4 separate ground-based tracking stations tracking the object. At the same time, he's tracking it on his F-16 radar. So in my estimation, and the estimation of some of the scientists out there that work for the Electronic Warfare Department for NATO, there was a solid radar target. There was a solid object being tracked on radar, and it was executing flight maneuvers that, as far as we know today, we can't even execute. How are we doing on time?
We're good.
We're good on time. Okay. Any other questions? Or if not, I've got some books up here if anybody's interested, if you want to read more on the subject or delve into a little bit deeper information on the subject. But do we have any other questions?
More wine? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. I really appreciate taking time out of your